Hi, I'm Elizabeth and today I'm here with the fourth and final part of Sagalong. I know I'm 2 weeks late with this, but the Sunday it was supposed to go up, I was on my way to London, and last Sunday I was ill with a cold I picked up in London, so here I am today because the completionist in me won't allow me to do anything else until I've actually finished Sagalong. And the text of the day is not in fact the saga, it's the Prose Edda, written, at least in part, by Snorre Sturlason, and it's a text written to teach poetry. And as such, it's also one of our main sources for knowledge about the Old Norse mythology and religion, because the poetry of the time was so steeped in these stories that you needed a working knowledge of the stories to be able to both understand or write the poetry. And this purpose also informs some of the content of the book. And a lot of that content is usually not translated. It's not in my Norwegian translation, and I had a look at the English translation in the Gutenberg project, and a lot of it is skipped there as well. And the reason for that is simple, because a lot of this book in the original is so language specific that it makes no sense if you don't already know Old Norse, so there's just no point in translating it. Some of it is grammatical information, and there's a whole part of this book called Hottatal that is a very long poem written by Snorre Sturlason that is not deemed to be a very good poem. I can't judge because I've never read it, but the interesting part of this poem is that it's written in 100 different meters to demonstrate possible ways of writing poetry to aspiring poets. However, you can't really translate the poem and keep the meters, and that's why it's usually not translated. And that leaves us with 3 parts of the book. One of them is a very short introduction. It's kind of hedging, just saying that we know that the people in this book are not actually gods, but people living before us didn't know better. But we know that there's only one God, the Christian God, and so read this book like those characters you read about here were actual human beings who was immigrants from Asia to the north. And they were worshipped as gods, but they were not in fact gods. So that's kind of the introduction. And then you have 2 other parts. The first is called Gylfaginning, or like the mirage of Gylfa, which is a story. There's a framework story about the king wanting to visit the gods, but the gods are fooling him, showing him a vision of 3 men called High, equally high, and third. That's the meaning of their names. And he's talking to them, asking them questions, and they are telling him about how the world came to be, about the gods and their position in the pantheon and their relationships to each other and adventures they've had. And you hear about the death of Balder, and you hear about the Ragnarok, where the world is going to end, and you hear about how a new world will rise from the remains of the old. And this cyclic worldview is very important in the Old Norse mythology. And then you have a 3rd part, which is called Skaldskaparmål, and that is just basically more stories, again explaining older poetry, and these stories are more specifically written down to explain specific terms and way of describing things in poetry. So for instance, the poetry itself can be called the Mead of Suttung, and you hear the story about why poetry is called that. And there's lots of examples like that. I read a Norwegian translation of this book, and just for the fun of it, I skimmed through the Gutenberg English version of it, and I noticed that there are other stories that are part of my Norwegian translation than the English. Most of it were the same stories, but there are some choices made different in these 2 translations, and that was interesting to me. And I also had a look at the translations of the poetry in the 2, because I've heard several of the English-speaking booktubers reading this book complaining about the translation into English, And I have to say, I much prefer the translation into Norwegian, and particularly in this edition I have, which is translated into some kind of fairly conservative New Norwegian, which is the closest you will get to the original in Norwegian translation. It makes it a bit harder for me to read because it seems a bit archaic, but still it's beautiful, and it keeps some of the rhymes from the original that would be lost if you translated it into a more modern kind of Norwegian. So I really liked the translation that I had, although I still wish that at some point I will be able to read this in the actual Old Norse itself. I have read part of this book in Old Norse, but that was with a lot of help from both dictionary and a teacher, and I cannot in any enjoyable way read stuff like this in Old Norse. Even though I did also have a look at Project Gutenberg and looking at the Old Norse version, and I was sort of surprised by how much I could understand or pick up on, especially because I already know these stories fairly well. I have had a very hard time figuring out how to talk about this book because it feels impossible to me. Because talking about this book in technical terms feel very soulless, and I think that most things I could say about this book and how it came to be and what it contains will mostly be just readily available at Wikipedia if you want to know it. And I don't want to make that kind of video today because this is a book that has meant so much to me personally, and I was thinking about it when I reread it for this project, that this really felt like meeting an old friend. You know, a friend you haven't seen in a few years, but when you meet, you're just instantly where you were when you last met years ago. And I was also thinking that my relationship to this book might actually resemble how some other people talk about Harry Potter and how that book had such an impact on them in their childhood. And for me, this book really had that role because, I mean, unsurprisingly for a person on BookTube, I guess, I was an introverted, fairly shy child, and in like 7th, 8th grade, I was not doing great socially. I was fairly lonely, and I spent a lot of time at home with my books, and that was when I started to be interested in the Old Norse world. It started to me with fiction books. I remember reading historical novels by a Norwegian writer called Vera Henriksen, and particularly a series that starts with a book called Hjertegn, or Omens. I don't think these are translated, but that was about a young girl called Sigrid, who was about my age at the time. I think she was 14 at the beginning of the book, and she's married off to an important man who lives in a different part of the country than her, and we follow her journey from being an insecure girl in an environment she doesn't know until really coming into her own and being the chief of the household, as was the role of the women of the time. And Sigrid was a real person. She is mentioned in Heimskringla, and her brother is called Tore Hund. He's one of the major players in some of the stories there. So these were really anchored in historical sources. Vera Henriksen is really known for being thorough, but she's also a novelist, so where the sources stopped, she would start inventing. And after reading several of her books, I wanted to know more about the world she was describing, about where fiction started and where what we actually know ended. And so I started looking up non-fiction books dealing with this time. I was reading a lot of it, and there were always quotes from the sagas and from Snorre, both the Edda and the Heimskringla, and there was lots of quotes from the poetry. And after reading a fair share of those books, I really just wanted to read the originals because I had seen so many snippets and I did not have the full context of it. So that's how I first encountered this book, after having sort of immersed myself in the world of these stories before going to the actual stories. So a lot of them were already somehow known to me by the time I actually got to this book. They had been used in fiction as stories people told each other, and all of Vera Henriksen's books really work with that time in Norwegian history. That's the breaking point between Christianity and the old religion, the old beliefs and rituals. And so that always created the drama in her books. So this mythological material was always very present, and reading them in the original, well, as close to the original as I can get with a translation, but reading the actual Edda itself was a revelation to me. And the only thing I really wanted when I read this book was that it would have been much, much longer, or that there would have been more books like it, because it was never enough for me. And then, since there are no more books like this, instead I went on to reading a lot of academic texts, sort of theorizing over all these stories, what they meant, how they could have been used, and using archaeological sources and other sources to just try to guess. But that's all it is. It's always guesswork. So I'm always coming back to this book and to these characters. And by now, the gods of this world sort of exist in my head as characters. I mean, I don't believe in them in a religious kind of way. But Thor and Odin and Frey and Freya and Idun and Frigg and Sif and Skade and Heidrun and Sarimne, all of these characters exist in my head as ideas, and they have personalities, and I know them, and they are my friends. They kept me company, and they kept me strong, and they kept me going through a time in my life where I didn't have many other friends, and that changed, and I got more social as the years went by. But for those years, these characters were so important to me. And reading this now, I realized that there are some things I have remembered wrong. Like one thing, there's a ship called Naglfar that is going to come at Ragnarok and bring all the evil people from Muspelheim, and they're going to battle the gods, and that's going to end the world. And they're coming in this ship, and the ship is said to be made by the nails of dead people. But I have somehow misremembered this, because I've always known it was made by nails, but I've just skipped the part about dead people. So from when I was 14, 15, whenever I was cutting my nails, I kept thinking, now I'm helping build that ship. I shouldn't be doing this. I mean, I didn't believe it, but still the thought was always here at the back of my head. And whenever there's thunder, I'll look up and think, oh, it's Thor going across the sky. I mean, these people, these characters in this book are just an integral part of my mental universe by now. I can't really explain it in another way, and that's why I love this book so much. And that I really, really enjoyed rereading it for this project. And I think I now want to go on to read the poetry part, the younger Edda, as well. I particularly like the parts which talks about the gods more than about the hero stuff. So that means I prefer Gylfaginning to Skaldskaparmal, because there are more of the stories of the gods in that. And I prefer the god poetry in the older Edda, or the poetic Edda, to the hero poetry that comes later in the book. I can't really say anything about this, looking at this from the outside, because it's all here. I have all of this. I have all of these stories inside me. They feel like my stories. and there's not really any other way I could describe this book. If you want to talk about specific stories with me, just do so in the comment section and I'll try to answer to the best of my abilities. I'm by no means an expert on this. I just really like the stories and I've read them many times, and I will probably keep reading them many times until I'm no longer here. And when I'm no longer here, I will be going to hell, because I'm not gonna die in battle, so no Valhalla for me. And just finally, I just wanted to say that I have really appreciated this project. I'm not one of the organizers. I just jumped on the bandwagon when I saw it, because this became a passion project to me, because it's something I really care about, as this video probably shows. And I hope they're gonna do the same next year, and I'm gonna participate again. And I think this has inspired me to read some more non-fiction, and as I said, probably also the Poetic Edda in the time to come. And now I have no more battery, so I'm gonna cut it off right now and say until next time, bye bye.